Tonight, on our century, Aussie's The Rich Colourful Tapestry.
It's a nice place, Giuseppe. Shut up in your face. That's a man. One more time.
Joe Dolce's Italian mother mangles the language and everybody laughs.
What do you think you do?
But there are others in the train. New Australians. A family of migrants from overseas.
In the last 100 years, nothing has changed us like migration. This was the century that the world came ashore. This was the birth of the new Australia.
Don't laugh at him! Show him how! Look, Joe, here. There you go.
It's pretty quiet here today, just the sound of seagulls. But during the 50s and 60s, our ports, like Station Pier here in Melbourne, were like giant refugee camps. This was the heyday of our biggest immigration program. In the years since 1946, almost 6 million migrants flooded through gateways like this one here. Now, for these new Australians, it was a new beginning, but they also changed the face of Australia forever, and quite frankly, for the better.
Taking me to Australia. He says that's the best place for me to get on in life.
I'd heard about Australian sunshine, but I didn't know what it really meant.
In the 1950s and 60s, Australia went after the British. Our commercials saturated them with sunshine and with smiles.
Sunshine was sort of 2 weeks on the Costa Brava. But almost every day out here is bright, and people feel, well, sunny, friendly.
Getting here was as cheap as chips.
You too can go to Australia for £10. Inquire now at your local employment exchange or at Australia House, London. And when these £10 poms walked down the gangplank, they were promised plenty of help to kickstart their new life down under.
We came to Australia 5 years ago.
Like most people who emigrate, we'd no home of our own to go to at first, so we went to a migrant hostel.
Not much to look at from outside.
But comfortable inside. But the hostel was never meant to be a permanent home, and we knew it.
While the beginnings might be rocky, things were expected to pick up quickly in a new country that would soon be booming.
I've been clocking on here since I came to Australia. Got the job through the government's employment service.
The great Australian dream could now be their dream. Like the rest of us, they could expect a home of their own.
Our neighbours are typical. We've always felt welcome among them because they know that we, by settling here, are helping in the job of developing Australia.
By any measure, it was an extraordinary effort. Not since the convict days had so many Brits come to Australia. In 1946, Immigration Minister Arthur Call announced an ambitious program to take Australia's population from just over 7.5 to 20 million people. Right from the start, the government wanted 70,000 migrants a year. And if they could all come from Britain, well, that was just fine. Now remember, Australians had been given the fright of their lives by World War II. The Japanese had tried to kick down the door. We needed a bigger population to defend ourselves and build our industries. The British's best approach was part of our long-standing belief. From the start of our century, Australia had stamped itself as both British and white. And we weren't scared to say so. This scratchy old film from the 1920s didn't muck about. Australia was a white refuge on the doorstep of Asia's yellow hordes. And 20 years later, in the 1940s, when we went looking for millions of migrants, attitudes hadn't changed a lot. Mind you, some Australians still had to be convinced that we could afford or needed any migrants, even the white British variety. In those difficult years right after World War II, Australia was still trying to crank up its peacetime engines. There was a chronic shortage of houses for Australians. So how could we build houses for millions of migrants? And many others, with bitter memories of the Depression days, were frightened that there just wouldn't be enough jobs for everybody.
But it seems to me that these thousands of migrants coming here going to do a lot of Australians out of jobs.
So it was time for the big sell.
Some have criticised Australia's migration program, but with new Australians like these arriving, even the fiercest critics are silenced.
Despite the sunshine, the salesmen and the subsidised fares, there just weren't enough Brits prepared to have a go down under. So we crossed the English Channel and went looking for Greeks and Italians and refugees.
These migrants were about to change the face of Australia forever. But it was a change the government would have to sell even harder.
Lots of beauties from lots of lands, but there can only be one winner, and here she is, folks, all the way from Holland. And now she's Miss World Fair, a regular Dutch treat.
On the move.
In the late 1940s, our immigration officers had made quiet sorties into war-torn Europe to check out the suitability of refugees. People desperate for a new start in life, in America, in Canada, or Australia.
Victoria docks Melbourne. The Misa, first of the post-war immigration vessels to arrive in this country, is awaited by thick crowds giving welcome to friends and relatives.
But Australian thinking had been shaped by our past and our isolated place in the world. We were still basically British, still Queen and Cricket.
Newspapers all over the nation levelled violent criticism at the low standard of living to which these new Australians were accustomed.
Arthur Calwell could shake hands, but he couldn't shake the belief that some had that this non-British immigration was just wrong.
With thousands of higher living nationals awaiting entrance, English, Nordic types and Americans, who can offer this country ideas and culture, it is little wonder that this project has been the centre of a bitter controversy.
While some insisted mistakes were being made, the truth was, in the early days, migrants from Europe were put through a grueling examination before they made it to Australia. Immigration officers were told to choose attractive, preferably fair types, who would fit into white Australia. For chosen migrants, good health was essential, which meant Andreas couldn't come to Australia with his family, because Andreas was blind.
John, you're the head of the family. You must decide. You'll have to leave Andreas behind, but the rest of you can emigrate as a family group. What are you going to do about it?
For Arthur Call and his team, September 1947 saw a public relations triumph. The newsreel cameras welcomed these new Australians from some place called the Baltic States. This carefully selected group, mostly blonde and blue-eyed, was just the thing to quieten concern about all those other foreigners. These people were nicknamed the Beautiful Balts.
Australia has given us the opportunity to start life anew. We hope you will like us. Look, a laughing kookaburra. He likes us.
But whether the new arrivals were blonde or brown-eyed, some Australians just didn't want them out here.
Dear sir, why must we let these foreigners come to live in Littleton? We don't want them. This is an Australian town, and we want to keep it that way. Yours, etc., a true Australian.
In the years ahead, attempts were made to try and change some of the old attitudes. Propaganda films like this aim to win us over to the group we now call New Australians.
But there are others in the train. New Australians. A family of migrants from overseas.
The federal government also encouraged the formation of what was called the Good Neighbour movement. Community organisations across Australia clubbed together to offer a cup of tea and a friendly face. It seemed the whole country was getting a lesson in how to welcome newcomers.
Down here. There you go.
Ah, pipe down. This isn't a bloomin' opera house.
Ah, don't take any notice of him. His liver's bad today. What's the matter? The missus been nagging at you again? May I sing, then? Of course you can. Sing all you want. It's a free country.
With people from so many different races and cultures, when you mix, it doesn't always match. But they had to get on with it. Australia needed the workers. The huge Snowy Mountains scheme, which began in the 1940s, couldn't have been done without migrants. Most local workers were too busy getting Australia kick-started after the war. We just didn't have enough people to do the job. By the mid-1960s, when the movie They're a Weird Mob hit the screens, Australians had changed forever. Like it or not, we were no longer basically British. And the story of Nino Culotta, the Italian sports writer who falls in with a bunch of rowdy builders' labourers, made us laugh. By the 1960s, we all knew a bloke like Nino, and we liked him.
If you please, I wish to drink some beer.
A schooner or a mini?
How long you been in Australia, mate?
Oh, I just arrived today, sir.
Oh, that explains it. These big glasses are called schooners and the small ones are middies.
Oh, thank you.
Schooner or midi?
I wish to have a midi.
Vietnamese refugees have been at sea for more than a year, and the captain has just said that if they continue to be shunted from port to port without being allowed to land, he could face a potentially explosive situation on board.
For 200 years, most new Australians came here by sea. These boat people were different, but they came here for the same reasons. This was a refuge, and this was a new chance at life.
And what do most people want to do on the boat? I think all of person in the boat now want to go to Australia.
These migrants were not invited, or even wanted. There was no government scheme to recruit them. They just turned up. When their life in Vietnam and Cambodia collapsed, after years of war and political strife, they took to their leaky boats and they headed south. The sudden, uncontrolled arrival touched an historic and deep Australian fear. Throughout our century, we'd been obsessed by the idea of being overrun by Asians.
Many nations have looked with longing eyes towards Australia and have desired to possess it for their surplus population. And but for the empire, they would long ago have knocked at our gates, sword in hand.
Almost the first law passed by the new federal parliament in 1901 had been aimed at keeping Asians out. The Immigration Restriction Act was the basis of the White Australia policy. For decades, the infamous policy had been almost a tenet of Australian society. It was partly old-fashioned racism, no question. But unions also had genuine fears that workers' pay and conditions would be undercut if hordes of Asian coolies were let in. Under the White Australia rules, even those who'd been allowed in after fleeing the Japanese during World War II were kicked out.
On the waterfront at Von Beach, Victoria, in this small house lives a family that is world news, the O'Keeffes.
Just how strict we were was plain to see in the case of Annie O'Keefe. As an Indonesian, there was no place for Annie in the Australia of 1949, even though she was married to an Australian.
Given sanctuary in Australia prior to the Japanese occupation of the Dutch East Indies, Mrs. O'Keefe and her 8 children have been ordered to leave by February the 28th.
It took a High Court challenge to keep Annie and her family from being deported. This was the beginning of the end for the White Australia policy. It was a changing world. The idea of White Australia was now outdated and embarrassing.
Hello, James.
Hello, John.
I'd like you to meet Mr. Naik of Pakistan.
Glad to know you.
And Mr. Harjono of Indonesia.
Glad to know you.
It also led to glaring contradictions. In the 1950s, under the Colombo Plan, we welcomed Asians with open arms to train and educate them. They were welcome just as long as they didn't want to live here.
Riforma della legge sulla cittadinanza.
But by the mid-70s, we'd grown up. White Australia as a policy was gone. The government even passed laws banning racial discrimination. A generation after the massive migration program began, Australia had become the true melting pot, a true success story in how to mix and care for peoples from every corner of the globe. And as we end our century, we can boast an extraordinary blend of race and religion and cultures that basically get on. But of course, not everybody's happy.
By the year 2040, 53.6% of our population would be Asian.
While some of the old fears remain, Australia somehow seems to be taking the changes with good humour.
Last count, there's 150,000 Vietnamese people in this country. 150,000, can you believe it? And only 3 surnames.
A friendly town, a real Australian town, made up of real Australians. Like Frank Schultz, whose father came from Germany 48 years ago. Jock Mackenzie from Scotland. Bert Tomlinson, born and bred in Lancashire, England. None of these people was born within thousands of miles of Australia, yet there's...
Over our century, we've always been a weird mob, always made up of migrants who somehow together built this extraordinary society. In the early days, the cry was populate or perish. We needed people for the cities, and we needed pioneers to fill the great empty spaces that we longed to tame. Of course, there were people here before. To the first Australians, we were all migrants. And while we've all had to do a bit of adjusting over the years, the saga of Australia's migration schemes has been an amazing experience of growth and of tolerance. It seems that all we need is time.
Congratulations for brand new Aussies. Among them, well-known personalities, including concert pianist Anatol Miroshnik. Previously, the oath was taken in the austerity of police courts, but now it's more friendly, as Australia says, you're welcome.
But the official films and the newsreels are only part of our story. It's in the small moments of everyday life, in those Aussie backyards, that we can watch the mingling of manners and so many cultures. In the 1950s, Bruno and Tina Battistel came separately from Venice, Italy. It was here in Australia that they met. Love and marriage followed, which produced the Battistel Bambinos, Lara and Dino, family film stars. The canals of Venice was their past. The Aussie backyard was now their playground. The Battistels' home movies show a wonderfully normal world. Snags and spaghetti went down well at the family barbecue. The vino and the virgin olive oil flowed freely. This was paradise found. For the family trips and the family picnics, out came the camera, out amongst the gum trees. It's all so ordinary, but that's why all those migrants took all those risks and came all this way. Millions of them, bound for the beaches and the backyards of Australia. No matter where they came from, they usually work hard, learn the lingo, and jump into the Aussie lifestyle head first.
I guess that's the typical immigrant experience. They've got a bit of us, and we've got a bit of them. Back in 1946, Immigration Minister Arthur Calwell wanted to use migrants to build up the Australian population to 20 million. Populate or perish was still the slogan back then. Today, with the count at more than 18 million, we're almost there. And now the question is, how much further should we go? But what's beyond dispute is how much we've changed. Back in the 1940s, who would have thought that Melbourne, the home of the Australian establishment, would become one of the largest Greek cities in the world? Who would have thought that we'd have mosques in our suburbs? Who would have thought that you could walk down some of our streets and pretend you're in Hong Kong or Hanoi?
If you've enjoyed our century, be sure to get a copy of the soundtrack CDs featuring music from the series, available at all good record stores.
But it is beautiful here. I like it. I like your country.